why it sucked to be Loki's companion. There's a fire going out now. Not quite embers yet, but just soft enough that the shadows flicker rather than stretch. You've been walking all day, and your feet ache from the frozen turf, uneven and merciless beneath thin soles. He needed someone to help carry a bundle, or maybe to speak a false name, or to sit beside him at a gathering and laugh at the right moment. It was never quite clear why you were there, but Loki always made you feel as if you were in on something, as if you knew what was coming next. You'd sit beside him by the fire, listening to the flick. Other times, he took you among the Vanir, where the gods were slower, stranger, smelling of wet bark and secrets half-spoken. You met people who looked at him with a mix of awe and suspicion, sometimes anger, like a borrowed coat that no longer fit. He called you Mist once when you passed a fisherman who asked too many questions. Because, Loki said afterward with a wink, you're hard to hold on to. You laughed. But a piece of you wondered if he had just erased you a little more. But never clarity. And always, when they asked who you were, Loki would answer for you. Each time, a different name. He told you that the barn had probably caught fire on its own. People blame what they can't explain, he said, and I'm very easy to explain. Too easy, maybe. Then he winked, and you forgot the rest of your thought. You didn't ask how he knew that, or the time he led you into a hall of mirrors, not literal ones, but gods who spoke in riddles and smiled too long, who stared at you like they knew something you didn't. You stumbled out of that place changed, not cursed, exactly, but altered. You dreamed of strange beasts for weeks. You spoke in rhymes you didn't understand, and crack of pine resin popping, and he'd tell stories of giants and gods, of marriages and monsters. He'd speak with such detail that it felt like memory, yours, not his. He made the world feel full of potential, full of stories, full of surprises. Without him, the days stretched long and gray. You stopped telling him how much your hands shook after the mirror gods. You hid the charm a seer gave you, a ward against shapeshifters. You didn't laugh as easily at his jokes, and Loki noticed. And part of you wondered if you were even real without his attention. He had a way of making you forget the silence inside yourself. You weren't sure anymore. You started to question whether you'd misunderstood it all, whether you were the one who got it twisted. Guilt settled in your stomach like cold ash. You tried to deflect, but he only nodded. Good, he whispered. You're learning. Then he walked on. You began to forget the shape of your own past, because his version was more interesting, more complete. And in the gaps where your memories once lived, Loki's voice settled, soft and sure. Or a woman accused of theft after she repeated something he whispered to her in jest. Loki wasn't there when it happened. He had already moved on, light-footed and humming. You were the only one left, and suddenly the villagers' eyes turned to you. Sometimes he would sing while walking, and his voice would rise above the wind like silver thread. Other times he'd fall silent for days, his expression unreadable, as if he were waiting for something only he could see. When he did speak again, it was often to reveal that he'd made a deal on your behalf. A small favor exchanged, a task accepted. Nothing you can't handle, he'd say. Besides, it'll be fun. He smiled a lot, a lazy, half-sincere sort of grin. And when he turned toward you with that flicker in his eyes, you felt chosen, useful, special. Loki hasn't looked back in hours. He moves lightly, always lightly, as if the road bends to meet his step, as if the rules of cold and hunger and tiredness don't quite apply to him the same way they do to you. Or maybe it was a story he told about a farmer you'd never met. Something was off. You noticed it, and maybe you even mentioned it. But Loki only smiled wider, brushed a bit of hair from his brow, and said, "Truth is only useful when it keeps things moving." Then he gave you something to eat. Something sweet, if you were lucky. A distraction. That's how it always started. The lies tasted like kindness, but they were a door you couldn't close again. That is the first thing you notice when you travel beside him. The world is tilted in his favor, but the price of that tilt is something you can't name yet. Something that's already building behind you, like a storm too quiet to be noticed. At first, it was flattering. The god of tricks, of shifting faces, of clever words. He chose you. But then came the first lie. It was small. A detail, really. A harmless name given to a stranger in a village you passed through. After that, it got harder to tell what was real. The days blurred. Sometimes you traveled with him to the edges of the Aesir's lands, where golden halls shimmered in the distance like illusions. And you let him, because there was something in his company that made your own name feel small. Then came the first punishment. It wasn't directed at you, not exactly. It was a farmer's barn, burned after Loki gave advice about how to store hay near a sacred tree. You tried to explain, but the words felt slippery. What had he said? What had he meant? Was it even wrong? But Loki returned days later with apples and a song. He made you laugh again. Traveling with him was like that. A fog of contradictions, sharpened by bursts of joy that felt too rare to lose. It was never fun. There was the time you had to distract a blacksmith while Loki made off with a blade he claimed had been unfairly won in a dice game. And still, you followed him, because leaving Loki felt harder than enduring him. But you also began to keep secrets. Small ones at first. He always noticed. One morning, by a lake so still it looked like hammered silver, he turned to you and said, "You've started keeping things from me." You never quite caught up again. You always knew he would leave you, even in the quietest moments, when he handed you a piece of honeyed bread without looking, or hummed to himself while fixing the strap of his sandal. You felt it, like the pull of the tide beneath calm water, or a cold draft in a warm room. He would leave. The question was never if, it was always how. The glint in his eye that meant he was about to tell a half-truth. The way he fiddled with his belt cord when he promised something he wouldn't keep. The path was quiet, misty. It felt honest. The birds didn't seem to be laughing at you. The trees held no secrets. The village had seen you with him. They remembered the red-haired god who had told fortunes for fun, who had juggled fire at the feast and said too many things no outsider should know. One woman had lost her necklace after he complimented it. A man's dog had gone missing. A boy had started speaking backward in his sleep, because even far from him, Loki's shadow walked ahead of you, shaping the path you chose. You just stood there at the edge of a frozen pond where he was skipping stones. Not stones, actually, but coins. They shimmered in the twilight as they spun across the water. He didn't look at you, but he smiled. Not a creature inside it, the mountain itself. "Mountains are stubborn," he said, "but even they will fall if you know what to say." He was proud of this. His voice was calm, thoughtful. You felt a chill you couldn't explain. Not of his lies. That would have filled too many pages, but of the moments. The first time he forgot your real name. Loki flirted with her, naturally. But it wasn't that. It was what he said about you while he did it. The way he made children laugh when he turned apples into birds that flew from their fingers. The soft hum of his voice when he thought no one was listening, shaping languages no one had spoken in centuries. He could be beautiful sometimes. Not in the way gods are, distant, golden, perfect, but in the way fallen leaves are beautiful when they swirl before the wind, temporary, honest in their motion. He answered with stories, always stories, about how the giant had once tricked him, about balance, about justice. He turned morality into riddles. He bent guilt into a game. Your name was lost. Your face was known only by those who feared it. You had become a figure in someone else's tale, a shadow beside a greater light. Even if you ran, the story would follow. You'd be the companion who betrayed, to a mountain where echoes answered before you spoke, to a river that ran in reverse. You stopped asking how he knew these places. You stopped asking what he was looking for, or the coward who left, or the fool who didn't see it coming. The way he laughed and called you his shadow, his silent fox, his little helper, and he wanted you to walk it with him. The way he made you feel smaller without looking at you. You sat by the fire that night and stared at your hands, wondering how long it would take to become invisible entirely. The first time he used you as a bargaining chip. The time he said, "You're lucky I like you," after talking his way out of a death sentence that had almost included you. You kept these not as fuel for anger, but as anchors, tiny stones to weigh down the growing emptiness inside you. You don't remember the giant's name anymore. Maybe Loki never told you, but you remember the sound his skull made when it hit the stone. You remember Loki's laughter, high and delighted, like a boy who just pulled off the perfect prank. You remember the blood, not the sight of it, but the sound, the way the moss soaked it up too quietly. Loki didn't stop laughing for hours. You didn't speak for days, because somewhere along the way, Loki had convinced you that your only worth came from being near him. You realized, with quiet sorrow, that leaving him did not mean leaving his story. You were in it now. You always would be. You found a small village, worked for your food, and tried to relearn your own name. The coins clinked gently as they fell into the water. You didn't ask where he got them. Someone called you clever, and you felt yourself flinch. The restless fingers when he was about to leave you behind for a while. Just a while, he'd say. You de-learned that a while was often long enough for you to be blamed for something you hadn't done. A stolen horse, a broken truce, a marriage that collapsed after an ill-timed whisper. Somehow, you were always the one left standing there when the dust settled. And Loki? He'd reappear with a new cloak, a new smile, and a story so wild it bent the air around it. And what you'd become when he did. Because by now, you weren't quite the same person who'd followed him through the woods that first day. You walked differently. You listened more carefully. You had become practiced in silence. Not just the quiet of being alone, but the deeper silence of watching your own thoughts before you spoke them aloud. Loki changed the pace of your mind, made you wary of your own instincts, made you second-guess joy or trust or admiration because you'd felt those things around him before, and they had not led you anywhere safe. You started to notice the signs earlier. The worst part was, you missed him every time he was gone. You tried to walk away once. You reached a crossroads near the black pine forests and turned east, away from the river route he'd chosen. But the peace didn't last. You had touched none of it. But you left anyway. Not because they forced you. They hadn't. They had only watched. That was worse. You left because the silence grew dense again. When you found him again, you didn't speak. "I knew you'd come," he said. "Everyone comes back. Eventually." You sat beside him, wordless. That night, as the fire warmed your hands and the stars blinked lazily overhead, Loki told you about the time he tricked a mountain into collapsing. And you wondered again, what had he said to you? You began to keep a little list in your mind. There was a girl once, Freya's niece, baby, or a farmer's daughter, shaped too beautifully to be ordinary. And yet, there were days you remembered fondly. You can't pretend otherwise. The time he created snowflakes that sang. But even beauty, you learned, has a price. You saw it the day he tricked the giant. After that, things changed. You started asking questions. Quiet ones, hesitant but there. Did he really deserve that? Was that the only way? Loki noticed. And you played along. Because what else could you do? You were in too deep. The only way forward was through. And so you followed him into darker places. To a hall where the walls wept oil. Because deep down, you already knew. He was looking for the edge. Always the edge. Of reason of patience, of fate. The mirror of mischief. There was never a single moment of peace when you rode with Loki. Even when the weather was kind, the fire warm, and the food shared in laughter, a shadow always hung behind his grin. Something unspoken, unseen, yet deeply felt. You could sense it in the way he tilted his head when someone spoke too long, in the way he grew still, absolutely still, when he was watching the others. Odin with his careful power, Thor with his impatient fists, Frigg with her knowing silence. It pulsed faintly with runes no one remembered, and Loki tapped it with one long finger, smiling to himself. "It speaks to me," he whispered. "It says things even Odin forgot." And just like that, he pressed both palms against it, and the ice split open like a wound. It was the feeling that you are no longer real in his eyes, just a shape, a shadow, a puppet in a story he kept rewriting over and over. To feel your own thoughts being questioned by your shadow. Loki's presence did that. It seeped into the corners of your mind, loosening the threads. It was the erosion. The slow, careful unweaving of certainty. The way he made the world feel like a story, and then made you unsure who was writing it. He didn't just bend truth. He questioned its necessity. And when you lived too long in that space, that strange, shifting fog where nothing was quite real, you forgot what it felt like to trust your own voice. You became a mirror, catching the reflections of his chaos. And sometimes, you weren't sure if your own reflection had been lost entirely. Not by force, but by doubt. He didn't tell you what was true. He just made you question what wasn't. And once you started down that path, it was hard to come back. What had he really done? Who had he really helped? What part of your story had you written? And what part had he slipped in while you weren't looking? The jokes didn't need names anymore. The companions didn't need faces. Just roles. Each one sang as it landed. You didn't ask why. You didn't want to know. He turned to you then, and for once, there was no mischief in his face, just a quiet sadness. "You think I ruin everything," he said. It wasn't a question. You opened your mouth, but no words came. He nodded. "It's all right," he said. "Even the gods can't tell whether I'm the poison or the cure. That's the joke, you see." He stood, brushed the mud from his cloak, and disappeared into the trees. You sat by the river for a long time, watching the stones sink. The fool who followed, the friend who stayed too long, the last one who believed. And when the tale was told again, in the hall, by the fire, in whispers under the stars, your name wouldn't be remembered. Only the laughter would remain. And Loki, grinning in the shadows, would clap his hands and say, "Ah, yes, I remember that one. Very funny, very unfortunate." From it rose an old voice, something ancient and cruel and too tired to hate. You'd seen the glint in his eye, the moments when he did something truly brave, truly selfless. Rare, yes, but real. You held onto those moments like a thread. Maybe he wasn't all lies. Maybe he was playing a longer game. Maybe, in the end, it would all make sense. But the longer you stayed, the heavier it became. The silence after a joke, the chill when no one laughed, the look in Loki's eyes when he realized he'd gone too far, and then smiled anyway. You couldn't understand the words, not fully, but the wind that followed felt like centuries unschooling. And Loki? He just laughed. Not cruelly, not madly, but as if the world had finally told him a secret it had held back for too long. When it closed again, when the ice sealed and the air stilled, he turned to you and said, "That didn't happen, did it?" You shook your head. You weren't sure anymore. And he smiled as if that was the best answer you could have given. Loki watched everyone, measured them, waited, and then sometimes he acted. One day, he was in your camp, stealing fish and warming his feet by your fire. The next, he was sitting with giants, whispering things you'd sworn he promised never to repeat. Another day, He was back in Asgard, feigning loyalty and saying he'd learned his lesson, only to disappear again the next morning, this time leaving behind a trail of goats that couldn't stop singing. You wanted to believe there was a pattern, that all of this had a reason, that Loki, in his chaos, was building toward some great misunderstood truth. But sometimes, in the quietest moments, when you looked at him and saw that flicker of distance behind his eyes, you wondered, maybe there wasn't a plan. Maybe the chaos wasn't leading anywhere. Maybe he was just lost. And maybe, by standing too close, you were becoming lost too. Not for glory, not for protection, not even out of anger. Not close enough to be called an accomplice, but not far enough to be forgotten. They didn't trust him anymore. Not really. They kept him around for his tricks, his insight, the occasional favor when all else failed. But you could see it in their shoulders, the tension, the waiting. They never fully relaxed around him again. And you felt it too. Every time he smiled too widely. Every time he gave you a compliment that felt just a bit too clever. You began to wonder, was this praise? Or preparation? Was he setting you up for something? Or was he just bored, but simply because he could? And if you were next to him in that moment, traveling companion, shield bearer, friend, the trouble that followed didn't just stain his name. It painted yours as well. There was once a long winter when the gods had grown restless. The sun seemed farther away, and the world felt made of iron. Loki had taken it upon himself to lighten the mood, as he said with that twinkle in his voice. At first, it seemed innocent enough. A few harmless illusions, a goat that recited poetry, a stew that changed colors as you stirred it. The others even laughed at first. But slowly, the jokes grew stranger. Odin's spear turned to smoke in his hand during a solemn vow. Thor's hammer vanished for a full day and returned sticky with honey and crushed berries. One by one, the gods began to look over their shoulders, searching for where Loki stood. And if you stood beside him, if you shared in the laughter, they turned toward you too, not with amusement, but suspicion. And in Asgard, suspicion was as cold and dangerous as the Bifrost itself. You didn't even have to be the one who set the trap. Just knowing Loki, just staying near him, was enough to make people wonder whether you were laughing with him or for him. The worst part was this. Sometimes, when he saw you being blamed, he didn't defend you. He didn't speak on your behalf or explain the real story. Instead, he watched, and you'd feel that odd silence settle between you. Not cruelty, but indifference. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even amused. He simply let it happen. Because deep down, Loki wasn't playing a game with the gods. He was playing a game with reality, with identity, with what people believed to be true. And you? You were a piece on the board. Sometimes a helpful piece. Sometimes just one he could sacrifice to keep the story moving. And when the story moved on, and people forgot your name but remembered the laughter, he would whistle, shrug, and move on to the next trick, leaving you behind with the fallout, and a reputation you couldn't quite wash clean. There was another day, maybe a memory, maybe a dream, where you followed him to a strange cracked stone at the edge of a glacier. It was exhausting, trying to stay close to someone who never stayed still. When the other gods turned against him, you were still nearby. And then came the worst realization. It wasn't the betrayal. It wasn't the blame. But what choice did you have? You'd followed him this far. You knew the stories. You started to dream in riddles, to see reflections that blinked when you didn't. There was a riverbank once. You sat beside it while Loki skipped stones. The trouble with following Loki wasn't the chaos, the blame, or even the punishments that always seemed to land nearby. And still, you followed. When even the trees spoke against you, there's a certain quiet that settles in a forest just before twilight, where each leaf seems to whisper its own secret to the wind. You may have walked under a canopy like that before, where the world feels as though it's holding its breath. A jester, yes, but also a problem solver. You, the companion, the friend, the tag-along in his schemes. You could no longer walk into a hall without someone watching you from the shadows. No ale was poured into your cup without a sideways glance. Even mortals began to notice. Your name isn't sung in the halls of Valhalla, nor whispered in the lands of the dead. You are the companion of Loki, and there is no place set aside for you. Just silence, and the faint rustling of trees, always remembering. Skalds would speak your name in whispers, never as a hero, but as a cautionary tale. You weren't just forgotten. You were deliberately remembered, but only as a warning. Don't follow that path, they'd say. That's the trail Loki once walked, and look what it did to the fool who followed. And in the dark of winter, when you wrapped your cloak tight and tried to sleep, you'd sometimes hear laughter that wasn't your own. Laughter with too many teeth. Laughter that remembered. You were the one who had to explain why the feast was ruined again. Because in the lonely stillness after the trick is past, after the gods have turned their backs, and even the trees have stopped whispering, you might recall the one night Loki looked truly tired. Not clever, not cruel, just exhausted. His shoulders hunched, his voice low, not scheming, but simply remembering. And he said, "I only ever wanted them to laugh." That moment haunts you more than any betrayal, because for a brief second, it wasn't a trick. It was a truth, a soft, broken thing in a man who could never stop pretending. And you wonder, did he ever have a real friend? Or just witnesses? Why the hall stank of seal fat and mischief? Why Thor was once more storming down the mountain without his dignity? And you couldn't even predict the pattern of it. One day, Loki was kind, generous even, pressing a hand to your back, guiding you out of danger with a clever wink. The next, he'd vanished, leaving you to answer to an angry Freya or a furious All-Father. You'd try to explain it. He didn't mean it, or he said he'd fix it, or he promised this time would be different. But the gods had heard all of it before, and eventually their eyes turned to you, not with pity, but with suspicion. Were you just a fool, or were you in on it too? Didn't he save the gods more times than he harmed them? He helped Thor recover Mjolnir, even if he was the one who got it stolen in the first place. He tricked giants, outwitted dwarves, and once shaved Sif's head just to set off a chain of events that would ultimately give the gods their finest treasures. That is the nature of the chaos he brought. It didn't he always look like destruction? Sometimes it looked like gifts. But the deeper truth, the one the trees seemed to murmur when you passed through a glade, was that everything Loki gave came with a curse folded deep inside. Thor's hammer? Useful, yes, but a weapon of endless violence. Odin's spear? A symbol of war and sacrifice. Even Sleipnir, Odin's 8-legged horse. Did you know it came from Loki's womb? For that, Loki had to become a Mare and lie with a stallion. He brought forth marvels, yes, but how many of them were born from humiliation? In Norse lands, that hush was not always peaceful. Sometimes the trees watched, and sometimes they remembered. In the sagas, the world is not passive. Stones speak. Rivers remember. And trees, well, the trees sometimes knew exactly who you were and what you'd done. When you walked beside Loki, you learned to fear the land itself. It was not just the gods who remembered your crimes. It was the roots beneath your feet, the crows in the branches, the wolves in the distance, and the very frost creeping down your sleeve. Because to be Loki's companion was to leave a trail, not of footprints, but of shame. At first, you might think this was merely paranoia. After all, wasn't Loki a god too? You might have felt that shame more than he did. This is where the true curse of Loki's companionship settled in. Not in fire or vengeance, but in isolation. But there's something else, something quieter still. And so you drift, neither god nor mortal, not quite belonging anywhere. The gods had long known that trouble often entered the world not with a shout, but with a whisper, not with the cracking of the skies or the roar of thunder, but with the soft paw step of something growing, something too big, too strange, too close to ignore. And so it was with Fenrir, the great wolf born to Loki, the shapeshifter, and a Jotun woman whose name was Boda, a name that meant something cold and sorrowful, a name heavy with the weight of foreboding. Fenrir did not come into the world in violence, but neither did he come into it in peace. He came how most things come, small, whimpering, alive. Yet from the moment the gods first laid their eyes on him, something shifted in the world. Odin, who sat on the high seat of Hlidskjalf and watched all realms with his single unblinking eye, knew that the wolf would grow. He saw not the soft fur nor the uncertain gait of a pup, but the gaping jaws that would one day tear at the sky itself. And so, he made a decision that all too many rulers have made across time: to preempt the future, to act before it unfolds, to strike at what might be. But even gods, for all their vision and wisdom, cannot always tell what their actions will bring. So they let the wolf stay, for a time. They told themselves he was not yet dangerous, not yet large, not yet strong enough to challenge them. They watched him play among them, run alongside the children of the gods, leap and laugh and snarl. And Fenrir, for his part, did what wolves do. He grew. He learned. He watched too. He listened to the way the gods whispered when they thought he was not near. He heard the pause in their laughter when he walked past. He felt the hesitation in the hands that used to scratch behind his ears. And slowly, he came to understand what so many do, that to be feared is not so different from being hated, and to be hated is very close to being betrayed. Still, they waited, unsure. And then they decided. Odin, with his sons and his war council, called for chains. Great ones, the strongest in all the realms. They told Fenrir it was a game, a test of strength, a friendly challenge to see how mighty he had become. And he, still young, still eager to belong, let them. The first chain was called Luingr, thick and iron-bound, forged in the deepest forges of Asgard. Fenrir broke it with a snarl, his body swelling with pride. The gods laughed nervously, calling him powerful, impressive. They returned days later with another. Drami, stronger, thicker, heavier still. It lasted a little longer, but not much. Fenrir strained against it, felt the links groan, and with a great surge, he shattered it too. The gods did not laugh this time. They looked at one another, and then looked away. The wolf panted, pleased, but noticed. He always noticed. Then they brought the third, not a chain at all, not metal, not loud with clanking or heat. It was a ribbon, soft as moonlight, light as a feather's breath. It shimmered, silken, silent, and its name was Gleipnir. The dwarves had made it, not in the forges of men, but in the secret places beneath the earth, where light never touched and truths were always bent. Gleipnir was made of things that did not exist. The sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the breath of a fish, the spittle of a bird, the dreams of a liar. It should have been nothing, and yet it was stronger than anything. They brought it to Fenrir and smiled wide. Just one more, they said. You're the strongest of all. Surely this little ribbon will be no match for you. But the wolf paused. He sniffed the air. He saw their eyes. He saw their hands. And he felt in his belly, in his bones, that this was not a game. This was not play. This was not safety. He growled low. I will not let you bind me, he said, unless one of you places your hand in my mouth. If this is a game, you'll lose nothing. They faltered. No one stepped forward. The silence grew. Until at last, one did. Tyr, the god of war, the one who had fed Fenrir, who had laughed with him, who had earned something like trust. He stepped forward without a word and placed his hand gently in the wolf's mouth. And Fenrir, with one last look around, allowed the ribbon to be tied. Gleipnir tightened. It did not strain. It did not creak. It simply shrank, smaller, closer, until Fenrir could no longer move. He roared then, a howl that echoed across every realm. He thrashed. He bit. And Tyr, god of war, lost his hand. But he did not cry out. He only stepped back, blood pouring, eyes wide, heart broken. Fenrir twisted and tore, but Gleipnir held. And the gods, now pale and still, drove a sword into the wolf's mouth, holding it open, leaving him to lie in agony. They left him there, bound and gagged, alone on a rock on a lonely plain. And as they walked away, some with triumph, some with shame, they told themselves they had done what was necessary. But in the years to come, they would dream of yellow eyes and wet breath and a howl that never faded from the wind. Because Fenrir was not just a beast, he was a child. And like all betrayed children, he would remember. He would grow not in size, but in bitterness. He would remember the warmth of Tyr's hand, the laughter in his youth, and how quickly it all turned to fear. And the gods would remember too, how soft the ribbon felt, how light it seemed, and how heavy its price would one day be. There's something haunting in the quiet before a betrayal, like the hush that falls over a forest before a blizzard rolls in. The gods of Asgard had made many mistakes by now, endless cracks in the veneer of their supposed wisdom. But the matter of Fenrir was different. The Allfather wasn't just a god. He was a schemer of the highest order, one eye buried in the past, the other squinting toward the end of all things. He let them bind his legs, his haunches, his chest. Odin sent word, not of war, but of payment. Even a young god Wolf knew the taste of lies, so they played their final hand. Fenrir waited. Then he strained, pulled, twisted. Nothing. No slack. No give. He snarled and thrashed, muscles rippling, eyes wild, but Gleipnir held. The gods had bound Fenrir, not because he had harmed them, but because he might. In their fear, they acted as tyrants do, smiling as they tightened the noose. And Tyr, the only one with courage enough to face him, paid in blood for their deceit. The wolf was not evil. He was not savage. He was betrayed. A child of trickery and chaos, raised among liars and caged not for what he had done, but for what he might become. It's a quiet kind of horror, isn't it? To be feared not because of your actions, but because of your father's name. To be bound because others dream of your destruction. The gods slept soundly that night, they say, but the sky knew better. And somewhere beneath the earth, a chained heart beat louder than ever, counting the days until the ribbon snapped. And as realization dawned, betrayal bloomed behind his teeth. He clamped down. Tyr did not scream. He watched as his own hand was taken, as the price of trust was paid in flesh. The gods rejoiced, but their laughter rang hollow. They had won, but not honorably. They had contained a child they had raised, shackled a creature born of prophecy, and sacrificed one of their own to do it. Fenrir howled a sound so mournful it cracked the sky. The gods, uneasy, stuffed a sword into his jaws to wedge them open. Blood ran down his gums. He could not speak. He could not bite. Only wait. Bound and silenced, the great wolf was cast into a forgotten place until the day he would break free. Tyr stepped forward, calm as the wind before a battle. He approached Fenrir in the fields beyond the hall, where the earth was soft and the sun hung low. "We have one more test," he said. "A thread forged by dwarves. Surely you can break it." Fenrir snorted. "A thread?" he asked. "Do you take me for a pup?" Tyr didn't flinch. "Then prove it. Let us bind you. And if you break free, none shall question your strength again." Fenrir paused, eyes flickering from Tyr's face to the strange ribbon in his hands. He didn't know what it was, but he knew the smell of deceit. And so he set one condition. "Very well," he said, "but one of you must place their hand in my mouth. If this is a trap, I'll need a hostage." Silence fell. Gods looked to each other, then to their boots. No one moved except Tyr. He stepped forward and extended his hand. Fenrir took it gently in his jaws and lay down on the grass. A favor, a commission. He asked them to forge a binding like no other, one so delicate it could not be seen, and yet so strong it would defy fate. The dwarves accepted, as they often did when danger stirred the forges. And what they returned with was not a chain, but a ribbon. Gleipnir, they called it. It shimmered with a soft light, thinner than silk, but colder than death. It was made from things that didn't exist, at least not anymore. The sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the breath of a fish, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the spittle of a bird. 6 impossibilities, woven together by hands that did not tremble. The gods received it and blinked. This was no ordinary restraint. This was a curse disguised as lace. He waited, and then, with a snarl and a twist, he snapped the chain like twine. The gods clapped and laughed, but behind their eyes, worry bloomed. The second chain, Drami, was twice as thick, laced with spells and blessings, and hammered under moonlight. "Surely this will hold," murmured the smiths. Again, they returned with forced levity and promises that it was just another test. Fenrir tilted his great head, fur bristling, eyes narrowed, but he allowed it. And again, with effort this time, he broke the chain in a storm of sparks and fur. The sound of it, the clang of failure, echoed through Asgard. That's when they knew. No chain of steel or spell would hold him. So they turned to those who could work beyond the natural order, the dwarves. Ragnarok haunted his dreams. And in those dreams, Fenrir loomed larger than any frost giant, any fire demon. It wasn't just that the wolf would one day kill Odin, it was that he would swallow him whole. That kind of fate tends to sit heavy in the stomach. So Odin did what fearful rulers have done throughout time. He sought to eliminate the threat while pretending it was about justice. He called together the gods and made a decision draped in civility. "Let us bind the wolf," he said, "not to harm him, but to test his strength. Surely, if he is innocent, he will break free and laugh, and we shall all be reassured." Lies wear velvet gloves in the halls of Asgard. The first chain they forged was thick and rattling, made of iron smelted from meteoric ore. They named it Luing, and they brought it to Fenrir with wide smiles. "Just a game," they said. "Let's see how strong you've become." This wasn't a battle of honor, or some war to preserve balance. It was fear, plain and thick and cloying. The kind of fear that seeps into the chambers of your heart and whispers that even the mightiest aren't safe from what they've created. Fenrir had been growing, not in wisdom or gentleness. No, he was a wolf born of prophecy, shaped from chaos, son of a trickster and a giantess. But he had also grown in size, strength, cunning, and worst of all, loyalty. As a pup, he had been almost endearing, his jaw too big for his head, eyes too sharp for a child, his spirit both playful and restless. Tyr, the god of war, was the only one who dared to approach him, the only one who fed him raw meat and scratched behind his ears with a wary hand. The rest of the Aesir watched from a distance. They laughed nervously when the wolf chased his tail or pounced on shadows. But laughter can curdle quickly into dread, and dread is a powerful motivator. By the time Fenrir could knock down pillars with a single bound, Odin had already made up his mind. Fenrir didn't trust easily, but neither was he cruel. Now, the dwarves of Svartalfheim were not known for kindness, but they understood limits, and how to quietly exceed them. But they couldn't just walk up to Fenrir with a glowing ribbon and hope for the best. They wound Gleipnir around his legs, his paws, his chest. It coiled like sunlight around water, soft and unyielding. And so, Gleipnir became not just a symbol of strength, but of treachery disguised as protection. They waited for the wolf to grow, not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. Fenrir, son of Loki and the giantess Angroda, was never just a pup. From the beginning, he was different. The Aesir saw it in his eyes, the burn of intelligence, the cold gleam of something ancient and vast, and still they let him wander. At first, it seemed easier to pretend he was merely a curiosity, a monster who had, somehow, not yet become monstrous. He saw through their smiles and sensed the weight in their silence. The ribbon was too soft, too eager. He cocked his head and asked, as if indulging a friend, why they wanted him to wear it. Tyr did not cry out. He did not fall. He stood with his arms severed, face pale, eyes filled with something beyond pain-shame, perhaps, or understanding. The gods did not speak. They did not cheer. They watched as Fenrir thrashed, cursed, spat blood and fury. The gods didn't slay Fenrir from afar. They bound him with conversation. It spreads like cracks through ice, reaching his siblings Jormungandr, the world serpent, and Hel, queen of the dead. They too are cast out. They too are judged not for what they had done, but for what they might one day do. The gods, so desperate to preserve their golden halls, poisoned the roots of their own future. They turned children into monsters, potential into punishment. And in doing so, they ensured that Ragnarok, the end of all things, would not be a surprise, but a consequence. They lulled him with kindness. They used love like a knife. That is the true terror of betrayal, not when enemies strike, but when those who hold your trust use it against you. Fenrir, child of chaos, learned from the gods what it meant to be cruel. They taught him that the world is built not on justice, but on survival. And survival, in the end, demands vengeance. They jammed the sword into his jaws, forcing them open, and bound him to a rock far from the light of their halls. The fetter held. His howls shook the sky, and they left him there, bleeding and broken, not just in body, but in soul. The gods murmured excuses, games, strength tests, honor. But Fenrir, ever perceptive, said no, not unless one of them put their hand in his mouth while it was being tied. If it was truly a game, then there was no risk. But if they feared him, if they intended betrayal, then let one of them risk the bite. It was a cruel logic, born of bitterness, but it was also fair. And none among them would step forward. None except Tyr. But the truth throbbed beneath every heartbeat. This was no ordinary creature. He had fed him, trained with him, spoken to him as if he were more than a beast. And it was that past, that trust, that made it hurt more. They called it justice. They called it fate. But none returned to see him. None dared face the gaze of the wolf they had caged. They feared that in his silence, there was still understanding. That even in his fury, he remembered every face, every word, every lie. Fenrir was no longer a creature of the present. He had become a god of the future, a god of endings. And they knew, deep in their hearts, that he would not remain bound forever. Tyr stepped forward, silent and solemn, and laid his sword arm into the great wolf's mouth. Fenrir looked at him, really looked, and then lowered his jaw. It was not submission. It was not agreement. It was a test of faith and a promise of revenge. The gods wound Gleipnir around him, each loop as light as air, but somehow tighter than death. And when Fenrir strained once, twice, and found that he could not break free, he understood. He had been betrayed. He had allowed himself to be betrayed. And he bit down. Fenrir was prophecy made flesh. doom with a heartbeat. Each passing day, the gods watched him grow not just in body, but in presence, as if the weight of his destiny was dragging the whole sky downward. He could already speak, think, reason, and worse. He understood what they feared. And because he understood, he learned to hide it, which frightened them even more. The wolf, they said, had to be bound, not killed, for that would have made them monsters in their own eyes, or perhaps awakened his vengeance too soon. So they tried trickery. Deep beneath the earth, where the hammers never ceased, the gods begged for a fetter that could hold not just the body, but the soul. The dwarves, clever and cold, smiled without smiling and returned with Gleipnir, a ribbon so thin it seemed delicate, almost decorative, like something you'd tie around a scroll or a lock of hair. But it shimmered with unnatural power. It was made, they said, from 6 impossible things: the sound of a cat's footfall, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, and the spittle of a bird. Impossible, yes, but that was the point. Gleipnir was a lie made real, and only a lie could bind what was fated to destroy the truth. The first rope they gave him was thick and braided, more symbolic than serious, like the kind of chain you use to test strength at a festival. Fenrir laughed and snapped it with a shake of his shoulders. The second chain was forged by the gods themselves, built of iron and imbued with magic. They called it Drami. This, too, he shuddered. Each time, he grew more aware that these were not games. Each time, the gods grew more cautious and more afraid. It wasn't just that Fenrir was strong. It was that he refused to be predictable. The wolf was watching them, reading them. He was not wild. He was aware. And in that awareness, there was something unnerving, something too human. At last, they turned to the dwarves. When they brought it to Fenrir, he was not fooled. Tyr, god of war and justice, was the only one who had ever shown Fenrir kindness. The sound echoed through Asgard, like thunder in a tomb. In the silence that followed, the gods told themselves they had done what was necessary. But necessity is a word often used to excuse cruelty. What makes this story so haunting isn't just the betrayal. It's the intimacy of it. But the tragedy doesn't stop with Fenrir. Loki's end? Ash, silence, and the dreadful cone it begins, as all final acts do. Not with a bang, but with a flicker somewhere between regret and rage. Between all the masks Loki wore, and all the faces he could never quite become. By now, the bindings were in place, slick with the entrails of his dead son, Seijen's face hollow from years of waiting and catching and suffering. Above, the serpent dangled, its venom drooling steadily onto Loki's brow, each drop a reminder that tricksters do not die loudly, they rot slowly. But let's go back just a little, to the silence before the scream. Loki's imprisonment was not just a punishment. It was the end of the gods' tolerance, the shattering of their delusions about kinship and redemption. He had been called blood brother by Odin, and yet even that bond, once believed to be unbreakable, proved brittle when set against the weight of betrayal. The murder of Balder Radiant, beloved, untouchable, wasn't merely the straw that broke the mythic camel's back. It was the spark that ignited the coming twilight. And yet, in those early days of Loki's torment, the 9 realms still spun on, unaware of how deeply the venom seeped not just into his skull, but into time itself. Seijen, ever the faithful wife, stood vigil over him. And if you imagine her as some helpless, passive victim, don't. She held that bowl with a stillness that terrified even the gods. And when her arms trembled from exhaustion, when the bowl overflowed and the venom hissed onto her husband's face, she did not weep aloud. She merely braced for his screams. For centuries, perhaps longer, this was their life. A pain loop, a shrine of patience, a marriage welded by punishment. You must understand, this was not justice in the mortal sense. It wasn't about righting wrongs or balancing cosmic scales. This was fear clothed in ritual. The gods knew that Loki was not truly restrained. Not his ideas, not his chaos, not the stories seeded across Midgard, where people still whispered of shapeshifters, foxwives, and clever devils with serpent eyes. Even bound, Loki moved through memory and dread, present in every hesitation before a lie, every flicker of envy, every small rebellion. He was no longer a person. He was consequence made flesh. A time in myth is always patient. The worlds aged. The golden age of Asgard dimmed. Mead halls grew quieter, and the Aesir slowly forgot how to laugh. Odin wandered further, one eye fixed on prophecy, and the other lost in regret. Thor's hammer arm began to tremble with age, and Freya stopped seeking joy in battlefields. Even Heimdall, ever watchful, blinked more often. Ragnarok did not begin with trumpets. Sit began with exhaustion. And in the cave, Loki waited. No chains last forever, especially not those forged in desperation. When the final link snapped, it did not make a sound that echoed. It was quieter than breath, more intimate than memory. Loki rose. The venom no longer burned. His face, scarred and weary, was unreadable. Saijin was gone, vanished into the folds of myth. Some say she fled before the end. Others claim she dissolved into mist, her purpose fulfilled. What's certain is that Loki did not look back. He stepped into a world that had already begun to crumble, and the land responded like dry wood catching spark. From hell came the ship of Nails Naglfar, its timbers creaking with the weight of the forgotten dead. Loki stood at its helm, a general of ghosts steering toward Vigrid, where the final battle would play out. But do not picture him as a roaring warlord or grinning villain. He moved like a man who had nothing left to lose, who had seen every betrayal played out, including his own, and accepted the ending written before the beginning. The battlefield itself was not a place of sound and fury, not at first. It was fog, gray and slow, silence stretching until it trembled. Loki faced Heimdall, the sentinel, the watcher, the one who had never once let his gaze soften. There were no speeches, no vengeance declarations, just the clash, the tearing of flesh, the breaking of destinies. Both fell, as all things must. The gods died, not heroically, not meaningfully, but inevitably. Odin was swallowed. Thor staggered and sank. Freyr crumpled in the shadow of Surt. The world tree groaned. The fire rose. But in the aftermath, in that dreadful calm after the end, what was left? A child steps out from the ash, barefoot on cracked soil. The sea has risen and fallen again, and the sky is clear. No thunder, no tricks, just stillness. And somewhere, deep in the roots of memory, Loki lingers, not as a god, not as a villain, but as a question. He is the why behind every myth, the itch behind every rule. Did he want this end? Did he shape it? Or was he simply the only one honest enough to push the story where it was always heading? You'll never know. That's the point. His tale is not a circle, it's a spiral. And spirals always pull you back in. There's a kind of silence that lingers around mystery, not the quiet of peace, but the stillness of something unfinished, half-buried, refusing to explain itself. And when it comes to Norse mythology, some of the deepest silences fall around the strange, tangled places where Loki's story begins to unravel. By now you've followed him through mischief and miracles, tricks and transformations. But if you keep walking deeper, into the frostbitten valleys of myth, you'll find the strange places, where the edges blur, where the old tales get darker, and where the gods begin to fear their own shadows. This is the part of the story where things stop making sense, where ravens circle too long over a quiet hill, where ancient stones bear markings no one can read, and where Loki, so often laughing and flippant, begins to behave like someone who has seen the end. The Norse cosmos, after all, is not a circle, but a spiral winding in and out of itself, across worlds that are both connected and not, layered like frost and fire on opposite sides of a cracked mirror. And in that spiral, Loki drifts further and further from the campfires of the gods and closer to the cold edge of something older, stranger, and unspeakably sad. There are creatures in these stories whose names we barely know. There are places like the Ironwood, a forest where trees whisper secrets that no god dares write down. There are children who were never meant to exist, but did born from Loki, or near him, or through him, like the monstrous brood he fathered with the giantess Angroboa. This is where the stories splinter, where you hear a tale told in one place, a whisper of Loki nursing a serpent, and in another, a different story entirely. One says he's hiding, one says he's chained, one says he's helping, and one says he's already halfway gone. You walk through this landscape not like a scholar, but like a wanderer, picking up fragments. Here is a tale told in a farmhouse, where someone once claimed to hear the howls of Fenrir in the night. Here is a rune carved into an old birch stump, older than it should be, marking the place where Jarmungandr was said to have slithered across the earth before plunging into the sea. There are stories that Loki grew quiet in these ears, as if he was waiting. Not repenting, no, never that, but waiting, like someone who has left a message in a bottle and tossed it into a future he hopes one to arrive. Some say the gods tried to bind him even before Ragnarok, sensing the unease curling in their bellies like storm clouds. But how do you bind a creature whose true form you've never seen? A fox? A fish? A flame? A shadow with eyes? There are more questions than answers, and perhaps that's the point. To follow Loki is not to trace a clean timeline, but to walk in circles that never quite close, each pass bringing you nearer to a truth you can't hold in your hands. And if you look at the mythology, not as a series of stories, but as a kind of ancient weather map, tracking the emotional climate of a people living on the edge of survival, then Loki becomes not a villain, not a hero, but a symptom, a signal, a warning flare from the subconscious. The trickster isn't just the bringer of chaos. He's the one who knows when the order was already broken, the one who laughs too loud because the world is already cracked. There are quiet moments too. Accounts of Loki wandering alone, whispering to things in the dark, leaving behind tiny gifts no one ever found. A comb, a spark, a song sung backwards. There are places in Scandinavia where stones still bear his name, etched beside other gods, as if people once prayed to him even after everything went wrong. And you begin to wonder not what happened to Loki, but what we lost when we stopped listening. In the cold, beneath aurora-lit skies, you might feel it, that flicker of unease, the sense that something is still turning, still shifting, that the story didn't end with chains or poison, or even with fire, that perhaps it never ends. Loki is always becoming, always leaving, always just out of reach, like a dream you almost remember. And if you walk long enough through this twilight of Norse imagination, you may come to see that following Loki isn't about reaching a destination. It is about learning to sit with contradiction, with ambiguity, with the parts of yourself you wish weren't there. That's the strange gift of Loki, not comfort, not justice, but a kind of uneasy clarity, that the universe is vast, that the gods are flawed, and that sometimes the only honest answer is a crooked smile and a story that doesn't quite add up. You may not want to follow him, but you already have. There is a peculiar kind of silence in the wake of mischief, one that doesn't come with peace, but with the breathless pause of a world adjusting to some newly twisted truth. And if you followed Loki down the winding road of his lesser-known tales, the detours that historians rarely recount, and the sagas only half remember in shadowy Nordic corners, you'd find yourself stumbling not into clarity, but into a fog made of riddles and consequences, a trail that veers off from the grand, burning halls of the Aesir into the strange, swampy in-between spaces of myth, where everything wobbles slightly out of focus. You wouldn't be standing beside the great gods this time, not watching him trick a giant into building Asgard's walls, nor weaving nets to outwit his own pursuers. Instead, you'd be standing among the forgettable and the fallen, the frostbitten fisherman cursed by a lie that grew teeth, the quiet widow left with a serpent child she dared not name, the old man on a trail north of Midgard, who swore that a strange traveler changed the fate of his cattle just for the laughter of it. To follow Loki, truly, means not sprinting after his most dramatic crimes, but tracing the aftermath of every small chaos he unleashed and walked away from, each of them blooming slowly, like frost spreading across a forgotten windowpane. You learned quickly that Loki didn't only disguise himself as a mare or a woman or a fly. He disguised consequences as favors, turned obligations into stories, and beneath every prank was a seed of destruction wrapped in humor dropped, like breadcrumbs for fate to trip over centuries later. Maybe you in the quiet hamlet where a nameless farmer once welcomed a traveler with red hair and too much charm only to find his granary emptied overnight and his dog speaking in human riddles until it withered. Maybe you're in the high halls of Alfheim, where the elves whisper of a stranger who taught them to write their names backward, which in time unspooled an entire generation's memory of their own songs. These aren't tales sung loudly in the mead halls. They are found in cracks, in complaints, in the lives of those who never made it into the legends. And as you walk these paths, the old footbridge that trembles, even when the wind is still, the ash tree struck by lightning, every midsummer the carved stone whose runes rewrite themselves every full moon. You begin to feel what Loki's path really meant. Not fire, not glory, but a creeping distortion of normal life. A chisel tapped once into the grain of fate, barely audible, that over centuries turns a whole tree sideways. There is something exhausting in this trail, something that frays at your mind the way hunger does on a long, empty journey. You start doubting the ground beneath your feet, the way the clouds move the taste of your own memories. Because following Loki isn't about drama. It's about erosion, the slow kind, the kind that carves valleys without you realizing it. And the deeper you go, the more the stories start contradicting each other. In one village, he is a generous guest; in another, a cruel thief; in yet another, the very founder of the place. And you begin to wonder if even the name Loki is just a mask worn by something older, a force of misalignment that slipped into the Norse pantheon by sheer narrative magnetism. You meet a young girl in a frost-hardened forest who insists she saw Loki weaving light into her mother's hair after she died, and a jarl who claims Loki once whispered into his dreams for 100 nights until he drowned his brother at a feast. Are they both true? Or either? It's impossible to know. You're beginning to understand that stories about Loki resist consistency like oil resists water. Even the geography shifts. What was once a field becomes a marsh. A dry valley becomes a waterfall. And maps that name his haunts begin to fade as soon as you copy them. The Norse world isn't just 9 realms connected by a tree. It's a weave, and wherever Loki walked, that weave puckered and stretched. And perhaps the most haunting realization comes when you start to feel it in yourself. When your own thoughts start circling strangely. When you remember things that couldn't have happened, when you hear your own voice repeating questions you never meant to ask. Because following Loki doesn't just show you what he did. It slowly, inexorably changes what you are. You become part of the dream logic world he left behind. A world where cause and effect are slightly unmoored, where laughter hides teeth, and the wind might be whispering a name it just made up. And by the end, if there is an end, you will be somewhere far from where you began. Not physically, perhaps, but spiritually, mentally, mythically unmoored. You'll see a bird blink sideways and wonder if that was always how it blinked. You'll walk into a village you visited yesterday and find no one remembers you were there. And at night, when sleep comes, you'll dream in languages you don't know, but seem to understand, riddles, Tricks, songs, long roads with doors in the sky. And maybe, just maybe, you'll wake one day and find a single red hair on your pillow, no longer sure if you are following Loki, or if you had been leading him all along. The older myths, the ones whispered in smoky halls, or remembered by wandering poets, often curled around a single question. What happens when the trickster doesn't just meddle in mischief, but cracks the very scaffolding of the world? And this question clung to Loki like a shadow. It was no longer a matter of shape-shifting pranks or laughing behind Odin's back. The air had shifted. Cold, suspicious, heavy. Asgard had grown wary. The gods had grown wary. The realm's laughter, once sparked by Loki's antics, had thinned into nervous glances and unsaid things. It's the way long friendships fray, not in flame, but in chill. After the death of Balder, a line had been crossed that even gods could feel but not explain. There were no formal trials for Loki, no dramatic stand before a thunderous Odin or tearful Frigg, because even then, justice in the Norse world was a strange, erratic creature. Sometimes it slept, sometimes it howled, sometimes it turned inward. Instead, there were silences, banquets that ended early, invitations that never came. The halls of Valhalla still sang with the clang of feasting, but Loki's place at the table grew colder by the season. And yet, he lingered, like a cough in the wind. He shifted form, as he always had, sometimes a mare in the forest, sometimes a whisper in a raven's ear. But what he truly became was a question the gods feared to ask. He was no longer just a companion, not an enemy either. Not yet. Just a presence. Watching. Smiling too long. The old stories speak of a cave far from Asgard, deep in shadowed lands, where Loki eventually fled or was hunted. The truth folds in both directions. Some say he hid there after being cursed for Baldur's death, his lips sewn shut by vengeful gods, blood trickling from his smile. Others say he was dragged there, bound not by rope, but by the entrails of his own son, the gods making horror a form of justice. And then, above him, a serpent, eternal, dripping venom on his face while his wife, Seijen, wept and caught the drops in a bowl. She stayed with him, for centuries perhaps, her hands trembling as she tried to keep him from pain. But when she turned to empty the bowl, the drops would land, burn, and Loki would scream, not like a man, not like a god, but like something ancient and breaking. And in that scream, they say, the earth quaked, storms rumbled, the sea hissed at the sky, because this wasn't just a punishment, it was containment. Loki had become the embodiment of instability, not merely a trickster, but a force. The very thing the gods most feared, change, chaos, consequence, and they couldn't kill him. Because gods, bound by fate, are often weaker than men in that way. So they shackled him instead, suspended him in agony, not to end him, but to pause him, delay him, put off the inevitable. But even in myth, inevitability stirs like thunder under soil. Loki's children, monstrous and misunderstood, still roamed the edges of the world. Jormungandr, the serpent, circled the seas. Fenrir, the wolf, gnawed at his bindings. Hel ruled the underworld, quietly collecting the dead. And the myths whisper that they were not merely outcasts, but waiting, preparing, for the day when Loki would scream not in pain, but in fury. For the day the bowl would shatter, the venom flow, the bonds break. That day has a name, Ragnarok. But it's not just an apocalypse, not a fire and brimstone ending. It's a rebalancing, a collapse so that something else can rise. In these stories, Loki isn't just a villain or a victim. He's the hinge, the moment history turns. And that's why, even now, the wind carries his name. Because deep down, the Norse didn't fear Loki because he lied. They feared him because he told the truth too soon. Because in the end, the gods' world wasn't betrayed by the trickster. It was exposed. And in the rustling leaves, in the crackle of fire, in the roar of distant waves, his laughter still echoes, not mocking, but knowing. A reminder that even the most solid myths are just frost on a morning window, fragile, fleeting, and ready to melt. There is a chill in the air now, not the crisp bite of winter or the howling frost of a Fimble winter's warning, but something quieter, a hush before the unraveling. This is where the long road of Loki's mischief begins to come undone, and with it, so too does the fragile order of the Norse cosmos. As you lie back, breathe slowly, and let your mind drift with the embers of the firelight fading. Imagine yourself not as a hero, not even as a mortal, but as something smaller, quieter, a bird tucked beneath the eaves of Odin's hall, or a shadow on the cold stones of Asgard, watching as the uneasy gods struggle to hold back a tide of fate they no longer understand. By now, Loki has crossed too many thresholds. He has tricked dwarves, angered gods, born monsters, and laughed while sacred bonds frayed. But even in these final tailies, the weight of what he carries and what he chooses to become remains strangely human. One of the last great stories before the end is the death of Balder, the shining god, beloved by all. You'd think a pantheon of stormbringers and worldcrafters might have thicker skin, but no. Balder was the light in their long, cold world, and when he began to dream of his own death, his mother Frigg begged everything in existence not to harm him. Stones, iron, animals, fire, even diseases swore to never touch him, all except one small thing. A single sprig of mistletoe, forgotten, overlooked, or left aside. Loki, hearing of this, smiled his old smile. He crafted a dart from mistletoe, just a little thing, and handed it to Balder's blind brother Hodr during the gods' strange game, where they threw weapons at Balder for fun, knowing he could never be hurt. Loki guided Hodr's hand. The mistletoe struck. Balder fell. Silence. That silence is what stays with you. Not the crime, not even the god's horror, but the way the whole world seemed to hold its breath. It was as if even the stones knew something had been broken. The gods wept. Odin, though stoic, knew this was the unraveling. Balder was not just beloved, he was necessary. Frigg begged for someone to go to Hel, the underworld, to plead for her son's return. Hermod rode Sleipnir, the eight-legged horse, down that dark road. And Hel, Loki's daughter, sat in her cold hall and listened. She offered a condition. If everything in the world wept for Balder, she would let him return. And so messengers went forth. Trees wept, stones wept, beasts and men, and even the wind. But one figure, an old crone in a cave, refused. She would not weep. Balder would stay in Hel. Some say it was Loki, shapeshifted again, laughing into his sleeve. But the gods were not laughing anymore. They captured Loki and bound him, not with chains, but with the entrails of his own son. They placed him in a cave beneath the earth. Above him, a serpent dripped venom. His wife Saijin, strangely loyal, sat beside him with a bowl, catching the poison. But when she turned to empty it, the venom fell. Loki writhed, and the earth shook. Earthquakes, the Norse believed, were Loki's pain. And so he lies there still, in the dark beneath everything, waiting. For what, you ask? Ragnarok, the end of all things? And when that day comes, the bound Wolf Fenrir will break free. The world serpent Jormungandr will rise from the sea, spewing poison. Hel will unleash her legions, and Loki will fight. Not for Asgard, not for vengeance, just because. He will captain a ship made of the fingernails of the dead. He will face Heimdall, the watchman of the gods, and they will slay each other. And then, silence again. The sky will fall. The seas will rise. Fire and ice will devour the world. And in that smoky aftermath, Perhaps a new world will rise. But not for you. You followed Loki, remember? You might have laughed at his jokes. You might have turned away when his cruelty began to bloom. You might have justified the little tricks, the clever lies. But now, as the sky cracks open and you feel the wolf's breath on your neck, you understand too late. Chaos is charming only until it has nothing left to burn but you. Yet even now, as sleep slips over your thoughts like mist over a forgotten fjord, you can't help but wonder, did he ever really want the world to end? Or was he just tired of not being seen? Either way, the story is over. The gods are gone. The stars are ash. And in that stillness, in that empty hush that follows the fall of everything, only one sound remains. The slow, steady rhythm of your breath, returning you to dreams. There is a kind of hush that descends over Asgard's great feasting hall, not the silence of peace, but the tense quiet of polished grandeur, where every carved beam and golden goblet glows under the weight of ancient eyes. This was no ordinary banquet. It was the feast of the gods, held in the great hall of Gyr, the sea giant whose brewing kettle could produce enough ale to satisfy every thirsty immortal. And as the firelight flickered across walls, carved with old victories and long-remembered slaughters, the gods reclined in comfort, having forgotten, if only briefly, the burdens of the world beyond their gates. There was Odin, the Allfather, quiet in thought, with one eye fixed not on the food before him, but on futures unwritten and the weight of prophecy that never slept. Beside him, Frigg smiled with the stillness of someone who had seen much and spoken little. Baldur, radiant and pure, laughed softly with Nanna, his beloved, while Thor reached greedily for a roast ox leg, slamming his mead horn against the table with each triumphant bite. The goddesses leaned in close to whisper of their dreams, and the warriors of Valhalla drank until their beards glistened with foam. The whole hall seemed suspended in golden warmth until the door slammed open. Loki had arrived, uninvited, unsummoned, and unwelcome. His eyes gleamed with something wild, like a storm trying to decide whether it should pass silently overhead or shatter the sky in rage. There was mud on his feet, dust on his cloak, and in his smile, a venom that sent ripples through the air. All at once, the music faltered. Harp strings stilled mid-note. Gyr's servants, those silent sea spirits with hands like silver foam, froze in place. Loki crossed the threshold, not as a guest, but as a reckoning. His voice rang out, sharp and bitter, calling for a seat, calling for drink, mocking those who had once called him brother. The gods, stunned, looked to Odin, whose face did not move. "There is no place for you here," someone muttered. Perhaps Frey or Tyr. But Loki laughed, and his laugh was not cruel, yet just tired like a man who had traveled too far through a land he could never belong in. He took his seat anyway, and as the mead passed to his hands, so too did the tension begin to bleed into every face. Then came the flighting. One by one, Loki turned to the gods and spoke, not with swords, but with sharper weapons, secrets. He unveiled Shamus, unspooled old betrayals, named lovers taken in shadows, glories unearned, cruelties once hidden in noble smiles. Against Frigg, he accused her of too much knowing and too little doing. Against Freya, he spat venomous jealousy, accusing her of loose love and cowardice. He mocked Jerd for the scent of salt clinging to his skin, a sea god forever stranded on land. Even the mighty Thor, so often the hero in tales sung by men, was not spared. Loki mocked his rages, his blunders in Jotunheim, his dependency on Mjolnir as though the hammer alone made the god. It was not drunken revelry. It was autopsy. The gods had known Loki, had dined with him, warred beside him, called him kinsman through blood and oath. But now he laid them bare. His tongue was a scalpel, and his memory a ledger of every injustice, slight, and secret they had hoped time would bury. Still, none dared strike him, for this was sacred ground, and though they burned with fury, they remembered the old ways, the rules of hospitality. But something shifted as Loki spoke, not just in the room, but in the weave of fate itself. This wasn't just flighting, it was fracture. Loki was no longer a clever rogue or a difficult brother. He had crossed a line, and every god in that hall felt it. The air was tight, the future brittle. And when Loki finished, when he flung his final insult like a torch onto dry kindling, he stood and left as abruptly as he'd come. The silence he left behind was thicker than any before. Even the firelight seemed dimmed, and the gods, usually so quick to return to laughter, sat in stunned quiet. The feast was over, not just the one on the table, but the long feast of order, of trust, of the golden age. For in that hall, under those high beams carved with victory, the gods had tasted something they couldn't name: fear. Not of Loki's words, but of what came after. He had drawn back the curtain, not only on their secrets, but on the inevitable fall of their world. And somewhere in the distance, beyond the edges of the feast, the first tremors of Ragnarok stirred. Far beneath the roots of the world tree, past where the light dims and sound begins to vanish into fixed silence, Loki lay bound. The gods had departed long ago, leaving him with a drip of venom and the flicker of shadows for company. His once clever tongue silenced by pain, his laughter dissolved into bitter stillness. He was no longer the jester, no longer the schemer, not even the hated traitor, just a presence in the dark. The cave walls remembered him in the way stone remembers, slowly, deeply, with the memory of ancient weight and cold. To speak his name was to admit their own failures and fears. He said nothing, not even to Frigg, whose quiet sorrow mirrored his own. Thor drank more loudly, his hammer swinging with extra force, as if to drown out the silence left by the missing laughter. Freya smiled often, but with tired eyes that held secrets and regrets. Tyr watched quietly, a sentinel against the rising storm, while the younger gods whispered of Ragnarok as if it were an old campfire tale meant to frighten children. Yet beneath the skin of the world, they all felt it a tightening, a coiling tension in the air. The silence where Loki had once spoken now, a vast and growing void. The Allfather remembered the prophecy that had always hovered over them, a future of fire and ice, of gods clashing and worlds ending. He remembered the laughter too, the way Loki's mirth once lightened heavy days and shifted the balance. Odin had taken the boy from fire giants, hoping to forge him into something greater, but the boy had never been fully shaped nor fully broken. What god truly molds a soul without cracking it? After all, Loki had once been one of them, a builder of walls, a bringer of laughter, a necessary chaos in the order of things. But now he was only a curse, a reminder of betrayal, an unwelcome shadow. Memories of his deeds faded beneath layers of anger and shame, as if burying the past could erase it. Yet the silence that replaced his voice carried its own weight, a heavy quiet that pressed against the golden walls and settled in the corners of the feast halls. Time itself seemed to slow and fold around him, becoming an endless loop of quiet suffering and muted rage. Above, in the halls of Asgard, the gods still feasted. They raised horns filled with honeyed mead, celebrated victories, and exchanged pails of old, but beneath the laughter was a thin undercurrent of unease. The room would fall silent sometimes, a shared glance betraying unspoken fears. They had punished the trickster, or so they told themselves. They had bound him, silenced him, and cast him into the dark. Yet the world still trembled. The wolf paced restlessly, the serpent churned the seas, and shadows lengthened as if the earth itself was aware of the fragile peace they claimed. Days and nights passed differently in that cave. The sun crossed the sky in steady arcs. The moon waxed and waned. Snow pressed itself against golden halls. But down in the earth, time folded in on itself. Loki's only rhythm was the venom's drip-steady, cruel, relentless a metronome marking the slow decay of his body and spirit. Only Saijin remained, her hands trembling as she caught each poisonous drop in a bowl, her presence a faint tether to the fading warmth of love and loyalty in a world gone cold. When she turned away to empty the bowl, the venom fell again, burning Loki's skin, eliciting silent screams that shook the stones. The gods rarely spoke of him now. It was easier not to. Odin sat alone in his high seat more often now, his one eye fixed not on the battlefields or the stars, but on the dark, forgotten cave below. Meanwhile, feasts carried on with a hollow echo. Meat roasted and mead flowed. Songs filled long halls where flickering shadows danced like restless spirits. Peace never lingers where guilt is unspoken. The gods feasted while the earth shook, and in the dark, the trickster burned forgotten, but far from defeated. The gods' hallways grew quieter with every passing season, the once vibrant echoes of laughter and clinking horns fading into a steady, somber rhythm. You can almost hear the walls themselves holding their breath, waiting for something inevitable to break through their golden calm. But by the subtle shifts in the air and the quiet changes in the gods' demeanors, the once bustling feasting halls, with their roaring fires and boisterous laughter, now hummed with a softer, more somber melody. The great oak doors, adorned with ancient carvings of battles long past, opened and closed more slowly, as if even the wood itself hesitated to disturb the growing stillness. They spoke of it as if recounting a legend from long ago, a story told around campfires to frighten children. But beneath their words lay an undeniable dread. They felt the tightening coil of fate, the slow drawing of the bowstring that would one day release its arrow to shatter the world. The grand feasts, once a celebration of victory and kinship, had become more subdued affairs. The mead tasted less sweet, the songs carried a somber note, and the faces of the gods reflected a shared but unspoken fear. The prophecy of Ragnarok loomed over him like a storm cloud on the horizon, an inevitable reckoning that he could neither prevent nor fully understand. He recalled the boy taken from the fire giants, the friend who had walked beside him in the early days, and the tragic transformation into the bound god of chaos. What was the cost of trying to forge destiny without breaking the soul? The answer lingered unanswered in the stillness. In the silence that filled these spaces, the absence of Loki was a tangible thing, like a shadow cast over the golden light of the realm. Imagine the gods seated in quiet contemplation, their faces etched with hope and dread. Outside, the winds carry whispers of change, and far below, in the silent cave, a restless god waits for the world to turn again. Meat roasted over fires that burned lower, mead flowed in quieter streams, and songs told of heroes past but hinted at an uncertain future. Thor's laughter, once booming and carefree, had dimmed to a rumble, and Freya's smiles bore the weight of unspoken fears. The poison's drip was a cruel metronome, marking time until the moment when the chains would break and chaos would be unleashed once more. The earth's tremors were his muffled cries, subtle warnings of the destruction yet to come. Yet the gods, caught in their fragile peace, pressed on with their feasts and sacrifices, clinging to rituals that could not stave off the inevitable. Tyr stood vigilant, a quiet sentinel amid the shifting tides of fate, while the younger gods' whispered conversations were laced with dread and anticipation. The great forests whispered with uneasy secrets, their leaves rustling in a language only the oldest beings could understand. The world outside mirrored this growing unease. The forests seemed to hold their breath. The rivers spoke in hushed tones, and the mountains trembled ever so slightly. The stars themselves blinked with uncertainty, as if hesitant to witness the destruction that would come. Rivers murmured softly as they wound through the land, carrying tales of change and warning. Mountains, ancient and immovable, shuddered faintly beneath their roots, as if sensing the slow shifting of the world's balance. The stars in the night sky, once steady and constant, flickered uncertainly, as if reluctant to bear witness to the approaching storm. He had been the spark of unpredictability, the breath of wildness amid order, the laughter echoing in the face of gloom. Each drop was a sting that racked his body and soul, eliciting silent screams that shook the very stones. Naming Loki was to acknowledge their own failures, the trust they had placed in a being who embodied both brilliance and betrayal. They remembered only the treachery and the pain he had caused, and the rest of his existence became a fogged memory, easily dismissed and dangerously forgotten. But in the quiet moments, beneath the veneer of order and celebration, the weight of that memory pressed heavily. Saijin, his faithful wife, remained by his side, her presence a faint tether to the warmth of love and loyalty in a world growing cold. Her hands trembled as she caught the venom in a bowl, an endless delicate task that kept the poison from touching his skin. Yet every time she turned to empty the bowl, the venom fell anew, and Loki writhed in pain. His silent cries a dark symphony beneath the earth. His binding was meant to silence chaos, but in doing so, it left a void that no song or feast could fill. The absence of Loki, once a source of chaos and laughter, had left a hollow space not only in the feasts, but in the very fabric of the cosmos. The gods, ever aware of the weight of prophecy, felt the slow unraveling, not just in the shifting winds outside their halls, but deep within their own hearts. Her eyes held the memory of Balder, the shining god whose light once filled the hearts of all in Asgard. She carried his absence as one might cradle a fragile flame in the cold, a precious but vulnerable light that threatened to flicker and die with the coming darkness. Her quiet sorrow was a gentle wind that stirred the golden threads of her weaving, patterns of fate that now seemed tinged with shadow. Thor, the mighty hammer wielder, found himself quieter than usual, his tempestuous nature tempered by the weight of looming doom. His thunderous laughter was less frequent, and when it came, it sounded like a distant storm on the edge of hearing. He gripped Mjolnir with a fierceness born not of joy, but of restraint, as if bracing himself against a coming wave. Odin, the Allfather, sat often in quiet meditation, his one eye gazing toward the horizon and beyond, seeking threads of fate woven in the stars and runes. He pondered the visions of the Norns, those three sisters who spun the destinies of gods and men alike, and wondered how much power even he held over what was to come. The runes whispered of fire and ice, of wolves breaking chains, and of a world reborn from ruin. These thoughts pressed heavily upon him, a burden carried silently beneath his calm exterior. It was as if the world held its breath along with the gods, sensing that what had been locked away in shadow would one day return to unravel the delicate threads holding all things together. In the silence that followed his binding, the Aesir wrestled with their own fears and regrets. Those quiet moments between the grand tales, when gods are left alone with their thoughts and the weight of foreknowledge. Odin, the Allfather, sat with a mind sharp as ever, but heavy with the knowledge that every chain could eventually break, and every silence might roar again. He pondered the runes, the threads of fate woven by the Norns, and wondered how much was truly fixed, and how much could still be bent by will and deed. In the halls, Frigg moved like a shadow, her quiet sorrow woven into the fabric of her long, patient waiting. She remembered Baldur's smile, the last light before the darkness, and carried that memory like a fragile flame against the growing chill. Thor, the hammer-wielding storm, was restless, his booming voice less frequent, his fists clenched tighter. The younger gods grew restless too, their youthful bravado tempered by whispers of prophecy, their dreams haunted by the knowledge that the end was coming. In these days, the grand feasts were fewer and quieter. The mead was less sweet, the tales less boastful. Even the great halls of Valhalla seemed to echo emptier without the trickster as mischief to break the rhythm. The gods had tried to convince themselves that they were safe, that order would endure beyond the coming storm. But deep down, in the spaces between the stories, the shadows lengthened, and the silence grew louder. The world around them seemed to respond in kind. The forests whispered with unease, The rivers murmured secrets, and the mountains shuddered faintly beneath their roots. Even the stars seemed to blink uncertainly in the sky, as if reluctant to witness what was to come. And somewhere in the depths below, Loki's binding strained against the inevitable, his restless spirit stirring as the poison dripped unrelentingly. The earth's tremors were his muffled cries, the sudden cracks in stone, a whisper of the chaos yet to rise. Yet despite all this, the gods continued their rituals, clinging to the fragile illusion of stability. Sacrifices were made, songs were sung, and the wheels of fate continued to turn, slow and inexorable. You could imagine the weight of it all pressing down, the tension coiling tighter with every breath, like a bowstring pulled taut in the quiet before the storm. And as you listen, you might feel that tension too, the slow, steady march toward Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods, when all that has been will be undone and a new world may be born from the ashes. But that day, distant and terrible, is not here yet. For now, there is only the uneasy peace, the soft crackle of the fire, and the low murmur of gods who know their time is running short. You might close your eyes now and imagine the golden halls of Asgard, lit dimly in the evening glow, the gods seated in quiet contemplation, their faces marked by both hope and dread. Outside, the winds carry whispers of change, and somewhere far below, a restless god waits for the world to turn again. The passing seasons in Asgard were not marked by the familiar rhythms of harvest or storm. You could almost hear the echo of that absence if you listen closely, like the faint hum of a string cut too tight, vibrating in the still air before falling completely silent. Frigg moved through the halls with a grace touched by melancholy. Even the younger gods, once filled with the bright fire of youth and promise, whispered in hushed tones about Ragnarok, the twilight of the gods. Outside the golden halls, the world itself seemed to respond to the growing tension. Beneath the earth, in the shadowed cave where Loki was bound, the venom drip from the serpent above him was a slow, torturous metronome marking the passage of time. The gods seldom spoke of him now, finding comfort in silence rather than confronting the complex feelings his absence stirred. Odin, in particular, carried the burden alone. His one eye held the wisdom of ages and the sorrow of knowing that no chain was eternal, no binding unbreakable. The halls of Asgard continued their rituals, but the air was thick with tension. Despite their efforts to maintain order, the silence left by Loki's binding echoed louder with each passing day. In the deepest shadows below, Loki's spirit stirred restlessly. You might close your eyes now and picture the golden halls of Asgard bathed in the soft light of dusk. There are banquets, and then there are banquets in Asgard. Not the loud, wild revels you might picture, not always, but something slower, deeper, and strange in its own way. Once a guest at that same table, once a voice that told stories, made them laugh against their will, twisted words like silk, and sometimes like barbed wire. He had once sat across from them, his eyes bright and his mouth full of riddles. And now he was beneath the earth, bound in a cave no one dared visit, not because they feared him, but because the guilt hung too close, because he still screamed sometimes. Because when the earth trembled, even slightly, they each felt a memory crawl behind their ribs. Not as a god, but as something in between. A clever wanderer, a trusted shadow, a favored fool, bound by your own choices. And they, the Aesir, would feast still. That those who claim to protect the world sometimes destroy a friend to do it. Loki betrayed them, yes, but they betrayed him too. And while their laughter rose in golden halls, his silence deepened in the dark. Not because he was evil, not exactly, but because he was never still, never grounded. Might still feel the pull of him, the glint in his eye, the charm in his voice, the way he saw through things others couldn't, the way he made gods uncomfortable, not with violence, but with truths they didn't want to hear. But because you've been reminded that even in myth, Even in the tales we whisper to make sense of the night, there are no simple heroes, no pure villains, only beings trying to be seen, trying to belong. Even the Trickster, especially the Trickster, the way he disrupted the order that pretended it was perfect. Let the noise of the gods fall away. Let the mead grow still in its cups. Let the halls of Asgard fade into starlight, and the cave below quiet to a hush. Let your own thoughts drift like leaves on the great river that winds through all 9 realms. The journey is done. The fire is low, and you are safe here on the edge of the tale. There is something deeply human in that, something that doesn't entirely fade, even when the story ends. He belonged to the in-between, the flicker between truth and lie, the breath before the laugh, the tear behind the joke. Yves stood beneath the roots of Yggdrasil and heard the drip of venom echoing in the dark. You've listened to the sound of chains drawn tight, of laughter sharpened by grief, of silence heavier than any punishment. You've learned what it means to be near someone like Loki, someone who breaks things and sometimes, in breaking them, reveals what was already cracked underneath. To walk beside him was to walk along a crumbling edge where certainty vanished with each step, and even the stars could not guide you home. You might have laughed beside him, run beside him, helped him escape a dozen messes before the dawn. You might have thought yourself lucky. After all, he was exciting. He pulled open hidden doors in the world, made magic leak from cracks no one else dared find. But then slowly, you would have started to notice the price. How others began to look at you differently. How chaos followed your footprints. How sometimes he left you behind just when the wolves came too close. Picture this: long stone halls, cold but golden, with the setting light of the 9 worlds bleeding through the high-slotted windows. Odin at the head of the table, one eye lost to the well of wisdom, the other glimmering not with mirth, but with the wenny visions. Frigga beside him, still and soft as moonlit linen. There's a kind of quiet that settles in once the stories are told. Not silence, exactly, but something softer. Like breath after a long sigh. Like the way the air feels just before dawn, when the world hasn't yet decided what kind of day it will be. Yves followed a long path tonight, through the shifting shadows of a god who is never quite trusted, never quite loved, but never quite forgotten either. Loki, the shapeshifter, the mischief bringer, the clever one who always laughed just a second too long. And now the fire has dimmed, the cave has grown still, and even Asgard feels farther away than ever. Thor slouched slightly, fingers tapping his goblet, though he never truly relaxed. And the others, Balder once, radiant and gentle, Tyr with one hand but a steady jaw, Heimdall always listening. Even when they laughed, it sounded like it echoed from somewhere else. They had seen too much. They had sacrificed too much. And on the nights when they tried to feast, when they tried to be merely gods at table, not keepers of fate, they still carried the silence of what they had done. Because down below, far below, something shifted in the dark. Something cursed and coiled, but once familiar. Loki. But the feasts continued. You have to understand, the gods must keep order. They cannot all weep for a mistake, not forever. And so the mead was poured, platters passed, stories were told. Yet if you had walked slowly through that hall, truly walked quietly, you might have noticed that no one spoke of Loki aloud, that his seat was never filled, nor even removed. It simply remained, cold and empty, as though the air around it still remembered his shape, as though they could not bear to erase it, nor bring someone new into its space. A ghost seat, a quiet admission that even the gods are haunted. Below, the venom still dripped. Above, gold still glittered, and both were true at once. Would you have sat at that table? If you had followed Loki long ago, perhaps you would have. And eventually, if you had followed far enough, you would not be at that banquet. You would be somewhere else, forgotten. It's a strange truth, isn't it? That power can be both luminous and cruel. Sometimes, the tale of a trickster ends not with fire, but with absence, not with punishment, but with neglect. Maybe, by now, you understand why following Loki was never safe. And yet, something in you might still wonder. You've walked through the mead halls and the ash trees, across the molten paths of gods and monsters. And maybe, now, you can sleep. Not because the world is safe, not because the stories are over. So rest now. This has been Deep History for Sleepers. If you're still listening, I'd love to know what part stayed with you. Good night.